Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're almost at lunchtime. We're almost there. But before that, we have a fascinating panel. Why invest in green? It will be no surprise to all of you that the climate agenda is rising up in terms of being a very pressing issue. For the first time this year, the World Economic Forum highlighted all of the top 5 global risks as relating to the environment. So the challenges that climate change poses to societies, economies, and the world at large have never been more pressing. So to achieve these net zero emission targets as set out by the EU and other countries, and to ensure the sustainability of our futures going forward, green technology and solutions are going to be vital to achieving this goal and going against climate change. Also, global venture capital is at record highs, rising about an average 20%, over 20% annually over the last decade. And as such, there is capital out there to invest in green. So, thankfully, we have an esteemed set of panelists with us today who can shed some light on this topic. First, can I please invite to the stage Agate, who is an investment director at Norrsken VC, an impact-focused VC fund. Thank you, Agate. Can I also invite to the stage Devika Thapar, who is a partner at Wilbe Ventures, also merging this sort of collaboration between scientists and bringing out those next green technologies. And finally, Rokas, please come to the stage, managing partner at Contrarian Ventures, who has a lot of experience investing in green and impact. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. So, we have an esteemed set of panelists. We can definitely cover this issue pretty well. But before we get into it, I want to ask, what does green exactly mean? I mean, green is the color of the conference we're at. We can see the color green, but what does it actually mean? Rokas, maybe you can start us off. What does green mean?
Yeah, it's definitely a color. And it's definitely a trend that is here just to start and to continue. So for us at Contrarian Ventures, green means, I think, a very big opportunity as a venture capital fund. I kind of tried to coin a term, energy tech is the new fintech. But I think I'm very limited in sort of how we organize ourselves from investment strategy perspective. What we understand is green. And we kind of focus on electrification as per se. So we invest in energy tech companies and e-mobility companies. And energy, as well as transport in general, is actually the biggest contributor to CO2. So we're, I would say, 1/3 of the green part, right? So there's food tech and other things as well there. So, and as a motto ourselves, we kind of put a mission to our venture capital firm as well to, be sort of people who would be thought as a go-to partner to partner on these issues, because I think complexity in the energy market as per se and sustainability is quite large because it's yet to be understand what it's going to be and how it's going to evolve as a structure.
So you've touched a lot on the energy market. Of course, green might mean different things in different contexts, Devika. So please, can you maybe explain your definition of green investing and how it might differ from what Rokas has just told us?
Sure. So I think there are 2 ways of looking at it. So probably one, which is more what Rokas was describing, the straight and narrow investing directly in technologies that address the climate crisis, so renewable energy, clean technologies. I like to think of it more from a macro and holistic perspective. So you're making investments that are sustainable. So you're combining profits with environmental impact and social impact and purpose, which is what you were speaking about before this. I think increasingly everything that we see around us, whether it's this bottle of water, the chairs you're sitting on, the buildings we're in, will increasingly be seen from a lens of sustainability. So it'll go beyond the realm of just solar, wind, and thermal.
Agate, what's your take on it? And maybe you can bring in also the impact investing. Green investing clearly is impactful, but maybe you also expand out the definition of impact investing more widely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Probably from the 3 of us sitting here on the investor side, we're the most broad impact investor. I mean, generally we say we focus on investments that have positive impact on people or planet. And of course, a lot of things that fall into the planet bucket are green investments. But I would say that generally green is a little bit misunderstood in a way that people always think that it's very narrow. And it goes back to, I think, green is anything that helps us to tackle the climate change. And there are 2 things that are going to help us reach those goals, it's one, we of course need innovation. We need to innovate the physical matter. That's, so there are a lot of green technology, scientific outbreaks in green technology. That's one way to look at it. But the other way to look at it is just consumer behavior. We also need to change how we act, and that can hugely contribute to CO2 emissions and reaching the targets. And I think that's one area that people don't usually think as green. I mean, some examples are blah cars. It's you could say it's one of the first impact tech unicorns out there. Car share riding platform that helps us to reduce number of car rides and hence link to CO2 emissions. So I think, from my perspective, I'd say that it's very important to remember that there is a lot that can be done in the consumer behavioral space, circular economy, and et cetera, which we also still define as green investments.
Sure. So we now know what green investing is. So to investors in the audience, what about opportunities within this space? Maybe we can start going across the panel, same as before. What are the most exciting opportunities for investors that are looking to invest in green, and perhaps why?
I think in general, when you look at this area, and I think we obviously will have different sort of understandings of how we tackle as investors to see those opportunities and back those opportunities with capital at the right moments when they evolve. So there's a top-down and bottom-up approaches. So from a top-down perspective, this was a great speech. Anyone who's a founder definitely should watch this, by Andreessen Horowitz, where they do like an annual conference for their internal portfolio companies, and they coined this a zeitgeist market fit. So there was a lot of product market fit talk, and there's a zeitgeist market fit. And zeitgeist market fit stands for a fact when there's a period of time, and timing is the most crucial element to reach a zeitgeist market fit, where everyone thinks it's important, but they don't know what to do about it. And we reached that. You mentioned Davos, right? I watched Davos like remotely, and I was like, this is insane. All these people that are super important corporate CEOs are talking about have no clue what they're talking about, in a way, right? And no disrespect to their corporate CEOs here, but like technically you don't know what you're talking about, because you're trying to basically spot it a way that you're going to be penalized as a corporate that is listed to a discount if you're not going to be sustainable. So you're trying to figure out what to do. And my answer to that is very simple: technology. So the top down, the trend is there. From the bottom up, it depends what you focus on. So we focus specifically on energy. So I think there's a great opportunity in the market, in energy market. So not everyone understands that, let's say, the way you consume energy today has been built in 1914, so 100 years ago almost, by a guy whose name is Edison, and who wants to understand the energy market better, watch this great movie which is called Current Wars, which explains how the grid was evolved from alternating current to DC current. Nikola Tesla was there. Fast forward 100 years, you have no innovation in the car industry. Suddenly this guy comes up called Elon Musk and reinvents the wheel and becomes the most valuable company, at least in US, and soon to be probably in US, given that he's rallying every day 10%. And there's these whole lot of new opportunities comes up, because you're redefining the whole infrastructure layer, and then suddenly you have the zeitgeist moment fit where there's software there as well. Suddenly you have, why clean tech failed in 2000? Because there was only hardware part. Now you have very affordable access to software cloud, and suddenly software becomes more important, and you reorganize the whole thing. So in that respect, we're not reinventing the wheel, we're just repeating history with the right timing.
Sure. So perhaps some accusations of self-preservation at Davos from corporate CEOs. Well, I'll leave that open to other people's interpretation. But there's clearly a lot of opportunities in the energy sector, as well as automotive, as we mentioned, Elon Musk. What about you, Devika? Where do you see as the most exciting opportunities for investors?
Yeah, so Alex, as you said, I think there's a lot of good innovation in the energy sector and transportation, but I think we've barely scratched the surface when it comes to agriculture, biodiversity, manufacturing, buildings. And at Wilbe, we focus on helping scientists to commercialize their research, and we really think science is the bedrock of creating a lot of game-changing innovations and technologies that will address the problem. So we look for stuff that is scalable, but we also look for things that aren't creating wasteful consumption. And I think we had mentioned it earlier, I think consumption is an elephant in the room that often doesn't get addressed. There's a lot of companies out there that do great innovation, but it doesn't matter if you're buying ethical hoodies or sustainable tote bags if it still ends up in a landfill. So the global rate of, just not to go off in too much of a tangent out here, but the global rate of recycling is only 9%. So 91% is dumped, burnt, or ends up as plastic in the oceans. And that's not just the textile industry, but it's even electronic waste, which is a surmounting problem that often we don't hear about because it's shipped off to less developed countries like Ghana. So when we're looking at exciting opportunities, we look at sustainable manufacturing. And for us, that's rethinking the supply chain from one that's linear, so from factory to landfill, to one that's circular and sustainable in nature. So one of the companies that we're currently looking at is a team of senior scientists from Imperial in the UK that have developed a novel process for turning agricultural waste into novel green chemicals and green raw materials. Similarly, in food, lab-grown meat is a very exciting area that's got the fancy of venture capitalists. Within lab-grown meat, which I think will be a massive space going forward, the area we're focusing on is not necessarily the end brand, but it's looking at the ingredients, the media that's used to produce lab-grown meat, which is currently incredibly cost prohibitive and is the reason why it's still pretty much inaccessible to the rest of the world. And so we're looking at ways of protein engineering that can reduce the cost from, let's say, $200 per kg to something that would eventually be cents per kg. And then another area is agriculture, but I can reserve that for another time.
A lot covered there, so sure. We've got agriculture, we've got lab-grown meat, and also, as you say, reducing useful consumption is key. It's not just about being sustainable as a company. What about you, Agate? What are you seeing as the most exciting opportunities in the green investment space?
I think both of my colleague panelists mentioned a lot of sectors already, so not much to add there. But I mean, the perspective I would take that, of course, there is a huge opportunity in the B2C space to offer the end consumer to be greener somehow in their day-to-day lives. But there's also a huge opportunity in the B2B space, and that builds on, Rokas, on your point that you were making about the corporate CEOs in Davos. I mean, today, sustainability, green energy and so on, it's the #1 topic in every boardroom, or is increasingly more #1 topic. So if you're a startup that builds something that helps these corporates or the CEOs to reach their goals, you have a real business opportunity. So I would kind of tackle it from the perspective that, yes, the B2C, but also B2B is a huge space. And we've backed, for instance, companies that help a startup called World Favor, a company that helps these corporates to track their supply chain, to be able to manage their supply chains better, greener, and more efficient.
You've made a key point there. So it's not just investors that should be looking at opportunities, it's also the budding entrepreneurs out there. There's plenty of potential to have a startup that's in the green space, because this is on the top agenda of corporate CEOs, corporate venture capitalists, etc.
And I would like to add one thing to Agate's point, actually. So this is actually one of the industries. I think in finance we saw it as well. Banks have been heavily involved in that because they own the biggest infrastructure there, right? So, I know that, Agate, your fund is backed by Klarna founders, right? So they built a challenger to existing big incumbents in that space. So I think what's interesting in the energy space, it's actually not, I call it not a revolution, but it's evolution. And when you have evolution of it, you have to have a collaboration model attached to it. Because in a lot of instances, if you're creating a software-enabled model to analyze a certain data set, you will have to collaborate with a corporate. And to be fair, the right moment to be asking that question is whether how complicated it's going to be. We have a lot of horror stories with corporates working with startups, right? But we have good ones as well. So what's funny enough to emphasize that in a green tech space, last year, 45% deals were actually done by CVCs. And it's not just a collaboration. Usually, we did deal. We invested BP Ventures. We invested with EDP, which is one of the biggest Portuguese utility, E.ON, Energy. They never lead rounds because they need guidance for the deal execution. But what they provide is a strategic value add to distribute the products that the companies are creating, entrepreneurs are creating. So this is a necessary element for the startups to be successful in that area, I think.
Sure. So that's great to see. There's collaboration between institutional VCs as well as corporate VCs. The strategy that comes along with the corporates being involved is a great phenomenon to see. Maybe I'll come down the other side or the opposite direction of the panel now. Agate, what are the most common misconceptions about green or impact investing? What sort of myths do we need to debunk for the investors and audience members alike?
Yeah, I think it's without trying to repeat myself too much, it's a little bit about this, that when we think about green tech, we always tend to think more about like real scientific innovation, and sometimes green tech is understood as investing in the carbon capture solutions or investing in the next energy revolution, be it nuclear or somewhere. But I really want to stress the point that it's a lot also in the B2C, the circular economy space, and there's so much opportunities in the circularity when it comes to some themes that we've done, be it food waste, exchange of goods. It's the key takeaway that yes, that's one area that is overlooked by a lot of people.
Sure. I know, again, we have touched on some of the misperceptions up to now, but do you have anything to add on that, Devika?
I think generally just green, or let's say impact, rather than taking a bigger term, impact, venture, and capital are just three terms that is often considered a big myth. So the idea that you can return capital to your investors by taking bold risks in stuff that can have impact and is green is ludicrous. I was in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago, and I was describing the work that we're doing and the problems that we're solving, and sustainability is one of our core pillars alongside health and security. And I think the response I got from a lot of folks who sit in the heart of Palo Alto was, oh, so you're an impact fund. Like, no, we're not an impact fund specifically. And I don't think that you need to be one and need to have that label. So I think that's a big myth, but I do think it's already being debunked. You've seen in the past 50 days since the start of the year, BP, Microsoft, Visa, Jeff Bezos, everyone has, and governments are all making commitments towards being carbon neutral. So obviously it's top of mind.
Sure. So, in other words, there are actually a lot of returns to be made in impact investing. Do you have any misconceptions you want to, or myths you want to debunk?
So you mentioned the good and important one. So we're here to make profit for our investors. My job is to make IRR at the end of the day. However, there's a word however in that sentence. There has to be, I call it a measurable impact that you can tangibly address as part of making that financial return. So part of it, the way you organize yourself to basically take that misconception out of the equation is, so we ask ourselves, how can we as an investor measure our portfolio, and how do we internally, so that's external measurement of that impact, and then how we internally as a group actually organize ourselves while we're making decisions, how we even live our lives. If we, let's say, if we completely disregarding the fact that, yeah, we're a green fund, like we're happy, and then you're kind of doing the opposite in your life, so you're not really believing. It's, again, the greenwashing part that we're coming in that equation. So it's both external and internal, and then social impact type of, I won't call it social even, but impact in general, how you measure it, it has to be clearly defined and then follow with the required financial return.
I'm very glad you've talked about measurement, because that was going to be one of my other questions. How do you even begin to measure impact? I mean, what are the sort of metrics you use? I don't know, not necessarily to go into the technicalities of models, etc. But I mean, how would you measure impact? Maybe Devika, you can start on that.
Well, this was one actually I was hoping to leverage on learnings from everyone else. So because we look at more than just green, we're looking at healthcare, for example. We're actually currently thinking through frameworks that would measure impact in a holistic sense, and ideally something that's almost like a single dollar measure. Some of the work that we're following is being done by Y Analytics and the Rice Fund that are calculating the impact money multiple, which is essentially a holistic measure of an IRR.
Sure, okay.
But I'm actually curious to hear, how you guys are measuring it.
This is probably where you can come in. I think I probably had originally picked you as the first.
No, I mean, it's an important question, and it's a question that's a lot debated in the impact space, but it's also a question that there is no clear-cut answer, that so far every player sort of creates their own impact measurement framework. There are a lot of frameworks out there, but then you take the one and adapt that fits, that's best suited for you. I mean, for us at Norrsken, we measure impact on 3 levels. It's sort of the immediate one. So I don't know, I was speaking about it earlier on the stage, so sorry if I'm repeating something, but it's like Tesla, you know, it's like the 3 layers, the key KPI, how many cars did Tesla produce? What does that equal in terms of CO2 emissions that they're taking out of the streets? But then the ultimate impact is the systematic change of the industry as a whole, that now every automaker in the world is trying to roll out their electric cars. And we apply that measurement to every single startup that we invest in.
Sure.
And the other, just to add to the investor point, but something that because it is easy to enter into this kind of greenwash territory. We as a fund, we are a return-driven fund, IRR-driven fund, but our profits, so that we as an investor can access the profits that we make from the fund, it's linked to impact targets. So for each investment, we set our return targets, but we also set our impact targets. And if we don't achieve the impact targets on a portfolio basis, we don't get access to the carried interest or profit, which is how funds make money.
Sure. Anything to add on this?
So I would tackle it from a different perspective, how we kind of look at it. It's 3 steps how we look at it at different stages of when we partner with a company. So it's a due diligence element where we ask specific questions as simple as that: why you're doing this, why this technology, what's the vision of this, what impact do you want to create out of this technology. That's a due diligence element, and we have certain questions that we want to benchmark it, how they organize, how they think about it. The second layer is when we actually invest in a company. So that comes to the fact on the investment committee level, but they have predetermined criteria that we also take into account as part of making that decision, in the team, product market fit, etc. And then the third one is actually the measurement to our LP to communicate in general public. What is our portfolio creating as a value besides the IRR, as we kind of spoke here. So that becomes the reporting part, which becomes more crucial ones. And as I also agree to Agate, we also have predetermined non-standardized KPIs for each company, because you cannot actually create a standardized KPI. There is some cool companies out there, and one is actually, I think, a Swedish or Danish company called Tomorrow. They're trying to build an open API for that. So they're trying to build an open API for company, for user, for likes of B2C, or for us to pull out, do a lot of integrations with Uber alike, and track our CO2 emissions on a daily basis on an individual level. But again, the change always starts with I, not with you. So you, need to implement these things in order to work, because you have to show by leading, as an example. And I think it always starts from your ideology as a fund or as a group that wants to contribute to this dialogue, how you organize yourself, and then putting it out there, because it's an upwards discussion among everyone. It's not that we're trying to create a USP for ourselves. We wish so, because then we can be better funds compared to other ones. But it's more like an open type of discussion to standardize.
So I think that's exactly the point. It depends on the ideology. There are different ways of measuring impact, but you are able to measure impact. There are methods out there, and why not make a return and create impact and have impact on the ground in the process?
And to add on that, and I think that there's so much debate that the impact measurement is imperfect and it's not exactly, 1 + 1 = 2 and all these things. And I'm a little bit like, even if you can't measure it perfectly down to the last CO2 emission or somewhere, at least you're directionally right. And as long as all of us are directionally going in the right direction, we don't need the perfect formula for impact measurement.
Sure.
And it's not a sprint, it's a marathon after all, and it's just the beginning of it, so
yeah.
We'll see
just the beginning. Here we go. Exciting area to be looking into as investors. Devika, I'm going to pick on you first again, sorry, but this is the area, this is the question you can definitely provide a thorough answer to. So of course, EU leaders reached a landmark agreement last year to get to net zero emissions by 2050. But of course, that's just one step. I mean, that's a target to work towards. Perhaps there's more that governments can do, maybe on a unilateral, multilateral level. How can government regulation and policy assist investors and stakeholders to invest in green sort of solutions and technologies?
Sure. So I think before diving into what exactly governments can do, I think to accelerate the change that's needed to achieve net carbon zero emissions, there are 3 key stakeholders that need to work in tandem, and that's the consumer, that's us as consumers, industry, and the government. I think in this particular sector, the government actually has a very critical role to play, and that's because traditionally market economics have not really worked in this sector because the environment for a long time has been considered an externality and still is by a majority of players. So industry and we as consumers don't really have an incentive to build green, invest in green, or consume green, except in a few exceptions like Elon Musk, for example. But even there, renewable energy has become a lot cheaper, partly because of technical innovation, but also because of subsidies that have been given to the sector. So to bring it to light with an example, if BP has decided to be carbon neutral, which they have committed to being publicly, if BP alone decides to reduce their oil and gas production, that doesn't necessarily mean that the demand for oil and gas production is going to go away. You'll still have other suppliers in the market, and if anything, higher prices. So I think one of the biggest ways for the industry to change as a whole is to have bold governments and bold, let's say, frameworks of incentives, mandates, and regulations that incentivize both the industry, we as investors, you as founders, we as founders, and as consumers to actually switch towards green or to build green or to invest in green. So what can that look like? So in our space, it's incentivizing private investors to put their money into science, which is traditionally a very risky area. And there's a lot of, I think we're very lucky that we're sitting here because the EU is, a leader when it comes to this space. So I can't even imagine if we were sitting in the US and you had a president who doesn't even believe that this exists. So I think we're very lucky.
So by the sound of things, there are a lot that governments can do. Subsidies have clearly helped in the past. I mean, are there any countries that maybe other panelists or yourself, Devika, that you'd highlight as really sort of front runners in terms of regulation and the environment for green investing?
The Nordics.
The Nordics.
In some ways, the Nordics, because there is the consumer sentiment, but there is generally this great responsibility that both corporates as well as individuals feel towards sustainability themes, but you can't really say that that's at the regulatory level. For instance, Netherlands have tax breaks for investors who invest in impact companies. The same is in the US. So I sort of think that that even Nordics could do a lot more to encourage impact entrepreneurship, and one good way to do that is through tax breaks on those investments.
Baltic perspective, Rokas?
I actually had a bit different answer in my mind, a bit more contrarian.
No, please, whatever your answer is.
I think number one is not the government. It's the founders. So I'll give you an example that will encompass the magnitude of underserved technology entrepreneurs in this area. BP did this very recently, but Shell has been, they call this the new energy department. They committed $5 billion investment annually over the next 5 years. Total cumulative round funding in venture capital in the energy market this year was a record, and it was at $4.3 billion. Therefore, meaning Shell only invested $1 billion because there's not enough entrepreneurs to back it. So what I call it, it's a buyer's market. So for you who have the talent, skill, and engineering, you have the choice to choose your investor. There's plenty of splendid capital there. And it's a great place to be and I think it's very underserved from an entrepreneur's perspective because there's a clear answer why. Because it's very complicated. And it requires engineering, not only the technology, you not only need a CTO, you need an engineering person that understands hardware and understands how this operates in order to make a change, whether that's food, whether that's, it's actually, for those who are interested, look at something that I say it's a role model for any government or university to do. MIT has a fund, which is a $100 million fund, which is called Engine. And Kate, who runs this fund, actually coined this as a hard tech. So it's not deep tech, it's hard tech because it's really hard. And majority of the funds that actually seek impact, such as Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is a $1 billion Bill Gates fund, which is now coming to Europe. Congrats for those entrepreneurs who would be there. They just, I think last week, started this fund of 100 million to invest in European entrepreneurs at seed and earlier stage, and they want to replicate the model. And that model encompasses having engineers, government, part of the dialogue. The other fund that I really like and I envy, it's a fund called Lux Capital, run by Josh Wolf, who's, I think, one of the most amazing venture capitalists out there. He also invests in super complicated areas like aerospace. He's investing in hard tech companies like battery technologies. And the reason why he organized himself as a venture capitalist is also amazing. He created a think tank that lobbied the government to create required instruments to support these companies, whether that's through DARPA or whatever the funding agencies. But I'm calling one important word for the governments, especially if there's government people there, the right programs, by listening to people who actually invest in that area, because usually they create something that is not applicable to.
So by the sound of things, there's a lot that governments can do, but it's not necessarily all got to come from the government.
It has to be a dialogue. It has to be a dialogue. Work together with all the shareholders.
Is key in this space, and let's be honest, it's the existential threat that we'll all be facing.
So there's a lot to
we have to work together on this. In interest of time, I want to make sure we have key takeaways for the audience. Or maybe we'll have a little bit more time, who knows. But just to make sure that we have key takeaways for the audience, what do you really want them to know from a panel like this? Why should we be investing in green? Why should founders be looking at as perhaps a green startup for their next venture? What are the key takeaways?
I really like the point that Rokas made. It really is, there's really a lot of capital that's chasing green opportunities, sustainable opportunities. So if you're an entrepreneur out there in the audience, then take an industry, look throughout the supply chain. You can find something that you can innovate or change and build a business case around it, and it's probably the most willing, hungry investor base that you'll ever have.
Sure. Devika, do you have anything? Oh, please, Rokas.
I think what's the most fascinating, touches only entrepreneur again. I think it's amazing to be an investor because you're in a driver's seat seeing all these amazing opportunities and can be a small part of it. But think of it this comparison. There are two great, I think, inventors in the world, right, in the car space, right? So there was Ford and Edison. In 1916, they actually wanted to proceed with electric car instead of combustion engine car. 1916. There was
if only,
please. A lot of things happened one for another, but think of it. Elon Musk had established something in 7 years that has been not done in 100 years. So why I'm saying this is the impact you can make for 100 years to be in the stone wall with your name is something that you cannot do in any other industry. Like seriously, if you we invested in one company that I want to share with you, for example, and it's the CEO of that company is a guy who is the CEO of Viber and Juno, both successfully sold. So he sold Rakuten Viber for 900 million, and he sold Juno for 200 million to the Get Taxi. And what he did as a third company is a hydrogen company, because if you get the hydrogen right, and for those who don't know, the biggest CO2 contributor is actually cement. And the heavy metals industries. If you get it right, you make an impact that will last for generations to come. And the only reason he went to that space is because before he said, I could raise 110 million tomorrow for a software company. I choose to do it because it's a hard problem to solve.
So by the sound of things, I mean, there is a lot of potential.
There's a lot of reward for entrepreneurs.
Yeah, but when you
not
think
from
of
just monetary
some of the criticism of, the startup world is that perhaps a lot of talent and focus being put on enterprise software solutions, for instance. Of course, that's amazing. You can scale up, you can make a lot of money, but it's not necessarily all about that. It
doesn't have a tail reward.
Yeah. Do you have other key takeaways that you want the audience to?
Yeah, well, in the theme of comparisons, if you think of the most valued companies today, you have an e-cigarette company, you have a teen viral video platform, you have a real estate co-working space, you have a $2,000 bike for indoors that's not even creating energy while you're pedaling, and that isolates you from the very thing that we're trying to protect, our planet. So if you just look at all these companies, they're all addiction-based. They're all incentivizing us as consumers to consume more and consume more in addictive areas. So I hope that green tech or green will be a new kind of addiction. And I'm really excited to see and meet with founders who are working in this space, even out here at this conference.
Sure. So a lot covered in this panel, and let's be honest, we could be here until late in the afternoon discussing this topic. But I think key takeaways from this: as a founder, you can make impact. As an investor, you can make a return and have impact if you're looking towards green investments. And that should be the key takeaway here. Let's take the color of TechChill. The branding is beautifully green. and take it forward and see what we can do together. Thank you very much.